I think I'm going to start, as many sessions here have started, that Dr. Iftikhar Salahuddin किसी तारुफ के मोहताज नहीं हैं, सब इनको पहचानते हैं. So I'd really like to give him the opportunity, having now solved all the technological problems, to move on to what is going to be a brilliant presentation. But before that, I just wanted to ask how many of you were at the inaugural session when the book prize for peace was announced. Dr. Salahuddin's book was shortlisted, one of three in that particular category. And then the chairperson explained that the book had been a marvelous presentation, that the book was a marvelous presentation, but it appeared as though it did not, if I recall correctly, have enough scholarly content. So I went back and looked at the book, and I found 5 densely packed pages of bibliography. I found that Muslim historian Sabia Akhtar had gone over the text and had examined it for accuracy. And then I thought to myself that perhaps one could have been more charitable in the view of the amount of scholarship that went into this book. But one thing that reassured me is that for Dr. Salahuddin, as he says, it was a labor of work. And he goes on to say that I admit that it would not be exaggerating to say that I'm obsessed with Jerusalem. Luckily, that obsession is shared by Dr. Naseem, but otherwise spouses don't very much enjoy having husbands become obsessed with other things. One thing that I thought we might reserve for later, if there is time, is to talk about where Jerusalem lies today, where a possible solution to Jerusalem lies today. But that is dependent on the presentation and the nature of the questions. Then perhaps we can have a little discussion about what is being talked about as the framework for negotiations, etc. So without further ado, over to Dr. Iftikhar Salahuddin.
Thank you. Can you hear me well? Okay. Ambassador Saab, thank you very much for your kind words. And ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you. And my apologies for the technical problems we encountered. I hope will be all right for the rest of the presentation. And the reason I wrote the book on Jerusalem was because I was fascinated by this city, enamored by the 3,000 years of history in that small city. And I was touched by the plight of the Palestinians. And I thought that one day I will write something to portray the Palestinians and the city of Jerusalem. So this is my presentation, and I hope you will enjoy and appreciate the history of this fascinating city. 4,000, can I have the lights off, please? Lights बंद कर सकते हैं आप? नहीं, lights. रोशनी बंद कर सकते हैं कमरे की, कम से कम करें, नज़र नहीं आ रहा है. आवाज़ नहीं आ रही है? अच्छा, चलिए, कुछ तो बेहतर हुआ. अच्छा, 4,000 years ago, a severe drought and famine descended on Mesopotamia, this country which we now call Iraq. Hazrat Ibrahim and his tribe of Israelites, whom we call Bani Israel, migrated from that place looking for food and shelter, and they go towards the west and find the land of Canaan, which the Jews claim was the land promised to them by the Lord. Next. Canaan is the biblical land, is located between the Mediterranean Sea and the River Jordan. And the present area comprises not just of Israel, but parts of Jordan and Turkey and most of the Gaza Strip. Next. Hazrat Ibrahim settled in this land, and it was here that he was given instruction by the Lord to sacrifice his most beloved possession. He offered his son, Ishaq. The Jews feel that it was Hazrat Ismail. Be that as it may, The sacrifice was done on a small hill called Mount Moriah, which was present in a city which is now called Jerusalem. And several centuries later, on this very hill, Hazrat Suleiman would build the temple of the Jews. And many centuries after that, Prophet Muhammad would rise on Miraj from this very hill. So all these three events have consecrated Jerusalem for all times to come. Hazrat Ibrahim and his wife Bibi Sarah, Hazrat Yaqub and Hazrat Yusuf are buried in the tomb of patriarchs in Hebron. And Hebron is about 30 miles from Jerusalem. Hebron is the city in the West Bank, and like all other cities in the West Bank, are surrounded by walls. And it was under control of the Muslims until 1967. It is now under the Israeli control, and it is a very volatile city. And it was here in 1993 that about 30 Muslims were massacred while praying in the tomb of the patriarchs. The tomb of patriarch is divided into a Muslim section, which is a mosque, and a Jewish section, which is a synagogue. Hazrat Ibrahim is buried in the Muslim side of the patriarch Ark of Patriarch, and he is buried down in a cave. And to see this, you have to peer down a shaft. Just a minute. This is the shaft, and you just have to look down it to see the grave of Hazrat Ibrahim. Hazrat Ibrahim is buried in the Muslim side. Bibi Sarah is also on the Muslim side. And Hazrat Ishaq is also on the Muslim side. On the synagogue side are Hazrat Yaqub and Hazrat Yusuf. Jews and Christians are not allowed in the Muslim side except for the 3 days of Easter and Passover, when in those 3 days Muslims are prohibited to come to the tomb of the patriarch. Muslims are excluded from the Christian sites permanently. They cannot do that. They cannot go on that side. 200 years after Prophet Ibrahim, Canaan was hit by famine and drought again. And Bani Israel was on move again in search of food and water. This time, they headed for the rich valley of the Nile River. And here they were forced into bondage and were reduced to servitude and slavery by the pharaohs. The emancipation of the Jews came in the time of Ramses II, when a deliverer arose from the family of the pharaohs and the palaces of the kings. It was Prophet Moses who told Ramses, "Let my people go." And he freed them and led them through the sea of reeds and came to Wadi Musa, which is now in Jordan. This was the Exodus, a defining moment in the history of the Jews. And the Jews celebrate the emancipation during the Easter and the Passover holidays. This is the route taken by Bani Israel from the Nile Delta across the Red Sea and coming into Jordan in Wadi Musa. Moses and his followers wandered for 40 years in search of the promised land. At one point, they rested in a small oasis town, which is today near Petra. Here, Moses instructs his brother Harun to look after his tribe while he seeks these divine guidance. The place where Moses leaves his tribe with Harun is marked as Jable Harun near Petra, and you can climb to that place or you can take a four-wheel drive up to that place. Moses experiences the Epiphany on Mount Tur in Sinai, where he speaks. Next. Please, next slide. ठहर जाओ. Excuse me. Please forgive me for this technical problem here. Allah speaks to him and gives him the 10 commandments. Sound not here? Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry. So Allah speaks to him and gives Moses the 10 commandments, and Moses takes these commandments down to his people. Here he is surprised and disappointed that his tribe has taken to worshipping a calf. He admonishes them, he chastises them, and when they are repentant enough, he gives them the 10 commandments. The Israelites placed the 10 commandments on the divine tablets into a box made of acacia wood and call it the Ark of Covenant, a covenant between the Jews and the Lord, which they feel is a covenant to promise them a status of a chosen people and a chosen land. They think that the Ark of Covenant is divine because of the presence of Yahweh, and only the divine among, or only the pious among them, could touch the Ark of Covenant and take it to a place of worship. Moses leads his people towards the promised land, and their journey takes them through the settlements inhabited by Ad and Samud, were the followers of Hazrat Saleh, and these are the mountains of Petra, where the people hewed homes into the mountains. Moses finally arrives at Mount Nebo, from where he could see the promised land. On a clear night, from this point, you can see the lights of Jerusalem and the lights of Jericho. Pope John Paul II, in the year 2000, visited this place and stood on the very place where Moses stood to watch the Canaan, the land of the promised people. Moses did not lead his people into Canaan because he died shortly before that event, and his burial site is not known. It was Joshua, whom we call Yusha, who led this tribe into Jericho and Canaan. Among Bani Israel was born Hazrat Dawood, and David was a strong man, a handsome person with a melodious voice, and many of the psalms are attributed to David. David defends his people against all the enemies, especially the Philistines, and he kills Goliath with a slingshot. And ultimately, he is declared as the king of all the tribes in the region. After many battles, David conquers the prized city of Jerusalem. He wants to build a temple here, and he wants to place the ark in the temple here. He selects Mount Moriah, the very rock from which Hazrat Prophet Muhammad rose for Miraj, and the same rock where Hazrat Ibrahim sacrificed his son. In an exquisite painting which you can see here, Dawood is seen with his harp, and he is ecstatic about leading the Ark of Covenant towards Jerusalem. But he was not to have this pleasure. The Lord told David that you are not to take this ark or build the temple in Jerusalem because your hands are full of blood. Apparently a reference to his affair with Bathsheba. The first temple of the Israelites was eventually made not by David but by his son Solomon. It was a magnificent edifice built with cedar wood from Lebanon, and the jinns who worked under Hazrat Solomon brought pearls from the Red Sea and precious stones which were used to complete the palace and the temple. King Solomon lived in great exuberance and style, and to this palace came the Queen of Sheba, and the throne was carried by the jinns. 400 years after the temple was built, catastrophe visits this Israelites. The neighboring country of Babylon destroys the temple, and the Israelites were devastated, just as we would be if Nauzbillah, Khane Kaaba or Makkah was destroyed. The Babylonians captured all the intelligent Israelites and took them to Babylon, and those who could escape, the Jews, went into the neighboring lands. This was the beginning of the first diaspora of the Jews. The diaspora was a watershed event in the history of the Jews, and it is comparable to the exodus from Egypt. In diaspora, the wise among them wrote commentaries and perfected the religion of Judaism, and the people, Israelites, were no longer called Israelites, but they were called Jews from this point on. The neighboring country of Persia, which was neighbors to Babylon, Cyrus was the king, and he was a very just king. And he saw what was happening next door, and he attacked Babylonia, and he defeated the Babylonians and gave silver and gold to the Jews to return to Jerusalem and build this temple all over again. This was the second temple of the Jews. The history of Jews continues, and the saga of the suffering goes on. It was the Greeks who came, and then after this, the generals of Alexander, Seleucid and Ptolemy. Finally, it was the Romans who came into Germans, and the first Roman governor appointed was Herod from Rome. Herod is a very, very important name in the history of the Jews because he rebuilt the second temple to ingratiate himself with the Jews, but the Jews were not to be placated. They went against the Romans, and it was a big problem for the Romans in Rome as well as in the Judea province to control the people, and orders were issued from Rome to take care of this Jewish problem once and for all. The person appointed to do this job was Titus. And in the year 67, he completely and totally destroyed the temple. The temple would never be built again, but only the walls built by Herod survive, and to these walls come the Jews, and they wail against these walls today, and it is called the Wailing Wall. Men and women pray separately at the Wailing Wall. Men are supposed to cover their head, but the women are not. They both write their prayers on paper and stick it into the crevices, just as we do in dargahs and our mazars. Worshippers cross across the courtyard to pay respects to David, and you can see on his grave is the harp, again suggesting that he had a beautiful voice. And David's grave here is open mostly to men, and women are seldom allowed to come and pay respects to him. Around 3 CE, which is the Common Era, Herod Antipas, the son of Herod, the original, was the Roman emperor, and rather Roman governor in Judea, and the second temple of Jews was standing proud. Just a short camel drive away from the city of Jerusalem, in the city of Bethlehem, a child was born to Virgin Mary. We took a public bus to the city of Bethlehem, which is a distance of only about 20 or 30 kilometers from Jerusalem. The bus passes through some of the most beautiful, clean and elegant localities, which are the Jewish part of Jerusalem. Although the distance is for about 30 miles and it takes about 45 minutes to get to Bethlehem, the bus was boarded by the Israeli security guards for 3 or 4 times to check the papers of the Palestinians. We, of course, were ignored because we were obviously tourists with the cameras. Bethlehem, like all West Bank cities, is surrounded by a wall. The bus is not permitted to go beyond these walls. It stops before it. The passengers are required to go through customs and security and then go behind the wall and take the cab to the center of the town of Bethlehem. The massive walls, which snakes for about 430 kilometers around the cities of the West Bank, are 40 feet tall and are complete with watchtowers and razor wires. Anti-American graffiti covers the wall. Here you can see the spelling is wrong, but the message is clear. The Church of Nativity is the heart of Bethlehem, and this is where Jesus was born. It is an unimpressive church, like a medieval castle, and does not have the grandeur of the St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. In the past, the entrance to the church was a large one where the horses and carriages could go through, as you can see that. But in the Ottoman period, in deference to the respect of this church, the opening has been reduced to this size, and one has to bend low to get into the church, hence the name, the Gate of Humility. In the basement is the most sacred part of the church where Jesus was born. And a silver star marks the exact spot where Jesus was born, and many lamps above the ark, above the star, reflect the many denominations of the Christian faith. The king of Palestine was informed that a child born in this area, in this time, would one day sit on the throne of Rome. So he ordered all the infants to be killed. Mary takes Jesus away to Egypt. At the age of 30, Jesus returns to Jerusalem on a Palm Sunday, and he heals the sick near the old temple and impresses the Jews with his knowledge of their religion, and he antagonizes the Jews who blame him for blasphemy, and they admonish him, and he is now a marked man. On a Wednesday, he had his Last Supper in a room on Mount Zion, which is in the old city of Jerusalem, and then he escapes from this dinner down to the Mount of Gethsemane, where he is hiding from the Jews and the Romans. The room is preserved in the old city, and to commemorate this, Pope John Paul II kept a brass tree in this particular room. This is the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus hides, and his disciple Judas reveals his identity to the Romans and the Jews, who arrest him and take him to the Roman procurator in Judea, Pontius Pilate. He's condemned and given a particularly harsh sentence of crucifixion. On a Friday, he's scourged and given the cross to carry it across the city to his place of crucifixion. The street on which Jesus walks to crucifixion is called Via Dolorosa, or the street of pain and suffering. And this is the street today, Via Dolorosa, through which Jesus once walked. He arrived on the hill of Golgotha, where he is crucified with two common criminals. In the evening, the body is placed on the stone of unction, and after preparing the body, he is placed in a crypt, which is also called a sepulchre. It was a tradition in those days that a day after the burial, they would go and look at the body, because many a body who were crucified were found to be still alive the next day. Next day being Sabbath, Mary, the mother of Christ, could not go to inspect the body, but they went down to the crypt on Sunday and found that the crypt was empty and there was no body of Jesus. But Jesus appears to Mary in her dream and says that he has risen. And thus Christianity was born and destined to be the largest religion on earth. 4 centuries after the crucifixion, Christianity was in obscurity until King Constantine in Rome converted to Christianity. He allowed the demolition of a pagan temple on the site where Jesus was crucified, and he wanted to look for the true cross and also the sepulchre. When they were found, he ordered the church to be built on this. He called it Anastasis, and the Crusaders later named it the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In Jerusalem, every Friday at about 4 o'clock, several pilgrims from around the world come here, carry the cross, and mark and walk in the route Jesus took for crucifixion. They stop at many stations and remember him along. For centuries, Christians and Jews lived together in an uneasy peace. At the time of the marriage of a prophet in 621, Jerusalem was the Qibla, and the city was in complete control of the Byzantine Christians. His emperor was Heraclius, who ordered all Jews to either convert to Christianity or leave Jerusalem. 8 years before Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, passed away, the Qibla was changed from Jerusalem to Mecca. And 6 years after passing away of our Prophet, Hazrat Umar ibn Khattab, the second Khalifa of Islam, won an epic battle against the Byzantines and headed now towards Jerusalem. The patriarch of the city of Jerusalem was Sophronis. The patriarch realized the futility of fighting with the Muslims, and when he heard that Hazrat Umar would be able to come to Jerusalem, he said, I'll give the surrender of the city only if the Khalifa comes to the city of Jerusalem. Umar arrived at Damascus gate to accept the surrender of the city, and he was met there by the patriarch of the city, Sophronius. It was a custom with Hazrat Umar that when he was traveling on a camel, he would take turns with his servant to lead the camel. And when the camel arrived at the Damascus gate, Hazrat Umar was not on the camel, but he was leading it, confusing Sophronius, who thought that his servant was the Khalifa. The Muslim Khalifa was dressed very modestly. His clothes were patched, and Sophronius was dressed in the resplendent finery of the Byzantine royalty. And the Christians who were watching this scene were surprised to see the Muslim Khalifa embody the virtues of poverty which the Christians cherish in their belief. The Khalifa first wanted to see the place from where Prophet Muhammad had risen in Miraj. The patriarch insisted that he go to the place where the crucifixion had happened. Hazrat Umar agreed, and while he was touring the church of the Holy Sepulchre, it was time for the Zohar prayers, and he asked the patriarch if he could pray there. The patriarch said, you can pray right here in the church. Hazrat Umar said, I'd rather not. If I do, then my followers would take this as a permission to occupy the Christian lands. So he asked his followers to step outside the Holy Sepulchre church, and he asked Hazrat Bilal to give the azan. Hazrat Bilal demurred. He said, I have promised myself not to give an azan after passing away of our Prophet. Hazrat Umar explained to him the importance of the place and the sanctity of the city, and that Islam was coming to the city for the first time. When the sonorous voice of Hazrat Bilal rose, it was an emotional scene. Hazrat Umar wept inconsolably with tears running down his face. After this event, much later, the Ottomans constructed a mosque just at this very place where Hazrat Umar had offered his prayers. It is called the Mosque of Umar. The rock of a prophet Hazrat Umar found was the garbage dump for the Christian city. He knelt down and cleaned and cleared the entire rock with his own hands, and his followers then helped him. He built a small mosque on the platform, and this mosque was very small to accommodate only about like 300 people. And more importantly, he realized that the Jews were not there in the city and they had been turned away by the Christians. So he invited the 70 Jewish families to return to Jerusalem and make their home again. And then This is the way the city looked after Hazrat Umar. There was a Jewish quarter, there's a Christian quarter, the Muslim quarter. A large square in the Jewish section honors the memory of Hazrat Umar in Jerusalem today. Mind you, it is in the Jewish section, and it's called the Square of Hazrat Umar, and his memory is desecrated only by the flag of Israel. After the righteous Khalifa, the Umayyad dynasty moved the capital from Medina to Damascus, and every Khalifa came to Jerusalem to take the oath of office. When the fifth Khalifa of the Umayyads, Al-Malik, when he came to Jerusalem, he saw that the Muslims were in awe of the Christians and the churches and the traditions which went on in the church. So he decided to build an imposing Islamic edifice which would be unmatched in beauty and in style. He ordered the building of the Dome of the Rock, which 1300 years later is the most recognized icon, not just for the Muslims, but for the Palestinians particularly. This is not the Mosque of Aqsa, but it is the Dome of the Rock. Mosque of Aqsa will be built much later by the son of Abdul Malik. Non-Muslims cannot enter the dome, but can only come up the steps to gaze at the dome from far. Now, Muslims can certainly go to the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa, but they are first stopped by the Israeli guards who ask you, are you Muslim? And when you say, yes, we are Muslim, then they ask a Palestinian guard to come from within to check the credentials of the visitor. For them, the Kalma Shahadat is not enough. They ask you to recite Surah Ikhlas. First was Surah Fatiha. And for a good measure, they also ask you to recite Surah Ikhlas. And I was thinking that these two surahs I know very well, but if they ask me to recite Dua Khanut, I'll be in trouble. The Israeli guards have heard Surah Fatiha so often, then they now remember it, they memorized it, and they vigorously nod the head when you recite the Fatiha correctly. This is the ceiling of the Dome of the Rock, and the semi-precious stones are gone and replaced by paint. The dome has undergone several renovations under every Muslim dynasty. The Ottomans under Suleiman the Magnificent replaced the facade, which has tiles inscribed with Surah Yasin and Surah Ikhlas. The interior of this dome is more alluring than any mosque I have seen in the Muslim world. In the basement, there is a cave where we believe Prophet ﷺ led other prophets in prayers. A few decades later, Al-Malik's son, Al-Walid, who is considered to be the greatest builder in Muslim history, built the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the very same place where Hazrat Umar has built a small mosque. The exterior has ancient and traditional calligraphy. The interior is very simple, and the attendance is very thin. This is the 5-day congregation which I attended, and when the walls were not there in the West Bank, you could not find a place for prayers here. But now there were only 10 or 12 qatars outside the mosque. This is the ceiling of the dome, and these are the famous stained glass windows of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I got a place to pray in the basement of Al-Aqsa, and one wall of the basement was the Wailing Wall. On this side of the wall, the Muslims were praying, and on that side of the wall, the Jews were wailing against the wall. So close, yet so far away in the beliefs and in ideology. Muslims ruled Jerusalem and the tomb of the Christ for 4 centuries. And in the 11th century, 2 events happened which unsettled the Christians in Europe. The controversial Khalifa of the Fatimids, Hakim, destroyed the mosque, the Church of Holy Sepulchre, and Alp Arslan, the Seljuk, defeated the Byzantines in Manzikert, and this was a watershed battle which the Byzantines could see was the death knell for them. So they yelled for help for the Christians in Europe. In 1095, Pope Urban II was in the papal seat, and in Europe there was a rift between the Eastern Church in Constantinople and the Western Church in Rome. When the head of the Western Church in Rome, the Pope, received offers or received requests for help from the Eastern Church, he was delighted, and in this he found an opportunity to get the two churches together. So he asked the Christians elite and also the Christian fighters to carry their arms and go for the help of the fellow Christians in Jerusalem. The Crusaders spread across Europe, and when they first saw the Jews, they attacked them because they blamed the Jews for killing the Christ. And this antagonism culminated in the Holocaust in the 20th century, and the historians feel that had it not been for the First Crusade, Holocaust would not have happened, and perhaps Israel would not have been created. Jerusalem was under Fatimids when Crusaders occupied Jerusalem, and this was the only successful crusade of the 7 crusades the Christians launched against the Muslims. The blood of Muslims and Jews who defended the city was knee-deep when the Crusaders attacked the city. And the streets were filled with dead bodies and carcasses, the smell of which persisted for many months after the Crusaders' war. The reverberations from this event are felt even today. For almost a century, Jerusalem remained a Christian city, and the Crusaders converted the mosques into churches and destroyed the synagogues also. The Crusaders covered the rock of the Prophet's Miraj with marble, and they hoisted a large cross on the dome of the rock. They converted the basement of the Al-Aqsa into a stable for the horses, and the Mera was converted into a latrine. Thus were desecrated all the sacred places of Muslims, and the Jews fared no better. Even as the Crusaders consolidated the hold on Jerusalem, Muslims fought Muslims and even schemed with the Christians to get support for their fellow Muslims' enemies. In 1141, from the feuding Muslim world rose a leader by the name of Zengi and his son Nuruddin, who defeated the Crusaders and turned the tide against the Christians. Nuruddin appointed a young soldier, Salahuddin Ayyubi, to control the newly conquered lands in Egypt, and after many impressive victories, Salahuddin was declared the Sultan, and the battles between the Crusaders and the Muslims continued, and finally, in 1187, Salahuddin won the critical battle at Hittin just outside Jerusalem, and the road to Jerusalem lay open for him. Sultan Salahuddin reached the gates of Jerusalem 3 days before the 27th of Rajab, which was the night of the Miraj. And he reminded the troops of the great honor Allah had bestowed on them, that they were to retake the city of the Prophet's Miraj, which the Quran described as a blessed area. He asked the troops to wait for 3 days before entering the city, and they would enter it only on the anniversary of the Miraj. Salahuddin allowed the Christians to buy their freedom. He ordered protection of all Christian churches, especially the churches built by the Franks of the Crusaders. He confiscated only the churches built during the Crusaders, and he converted them into madrasas. He uncovered the sacred rock and removed the cross from the dome and sent it to the Khalifa in Baghdad. On the 4th of Shaban, after 90 years, Christian occupation of the Aqsa and the dome were over, and the area was filled with worshippers, and many sought the honor of delivering the first Friday khutbah. And for this, Salahuddin Ayyubi chose a young man of 30 years, and he gave a sermon which people would remember for centuries to come. He extolled the success of the Sultan and, paying tribute to his courage, reminded the Muslims that the victory came not from the sword but from the piety and submission to Almighty. Sultan Salahuddin was again against the Shias, and in the New Jerusalem, Sufis and scholars moved back and identified in the Miraj, the Sufis identified in the Miraj the vindication of the communion with Allah. Salahuddin honored the traditions of Hazrat Umar, and he invited the families of Jews to move to Jerusalem, and among them was Maimonides, who had escaped the persecution in Spain by the Muslim Almohads, and he came down to Ottoman Empire and then into Egypt and became a physician to Salahuddin Ayyubi. The name of Salahuddin is inscribed on the ceiling of the Dome of the Rock, and to the Jews, Salahuddin was a savior, and a major road across the old city is named after him. And when people ask me by name, I never said it was Salahuddin, I said it is Salahuddin. And they were very happy. So, Marhaba Salahuddin, we welcome you to Jerusalem, we need you here again. 6 years after the conquest of Jerusalem, Salahuddin lay dying in Damascus. The wars and the crusades had taken toll on his health. He asked from his deathbed his standard bearer, Bahauddin, to hoist a white flag and take it to the souks of Damascus and announce that Salahuddin was leaving them. The souks shut down, the young and the old congregated at the citadel to say goodbye to Salahuddin. And it was discovered that the Sultan, who had fought so many successful wars, did not have enough money saved to buy even clay to cover or to get his to cover his grave. He was first buried in the citadel, which was the place he loved, and later he was reinterred in the courtyard of Damascus Umayyad Mosque. Sadly, the glory of Jerusalem passed away with the death of Salahuddin. The Ayyubids of the Salahuddin's family and clan even gave away the city to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II in return for promises not to attack the Muslim territories again. But the fortunes of the city changed when the slave dynasty of the Mamluks in Egypt occupied Jerusalem and brought about a renaissance in architecture. Two of the finest examples of this architecture in this period are, number one, the Sabil of Qaitbeh, and the minar in the platform, around the platform of the Temple Mount. The golden period of Mamluks continued for about 3 centuries, and the end came in the 16th century at the hands of Sultan Salim of the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Salim was one of the 36 sultans who ruled the Jerusalem city, and it was only Suleiman the Magnificent who would be remembered for his contributions to the city. He built this beautiful wall, and then he also took care of the Dome of the Rock. It was during the Ottomans' rule that the Zionism took roots in Palestine. Meanwhile, the British defeated the Ottomans, and anti-Semitism and Holocaust spread across Europe, and the British then encouraged the Jews of Europe to go to Palestine and build a new home. And the mantra was a land without people for the people without land. And they came here by the hundreds and then by the thousands. The Palestinians fought back, but the Jews were backed by the superpowers, and they couldn't do very much. And in 1948, Israel was created on the usurped land of the Palestinians. Despite the creation of Israel, the Arabs could not unite among themselves, and in false bravado threatened to push Israel into the sea. The Israelis took the threat seriously, and in 1967 launched a blistering attack on the Palestinian land, and in 6 days took over the entire Palestine. Muslims and Jews who'd fought for Jerusalem city for 40 days with their blood the Arabs lost Jerusalem in 6 days. Jerusalem, Jericho, Hebron, and Gaza, which were under Muslim rule for centuries, are now under Jews. All West Bank cities are imprisoned by these massive walls, which divide families and friends. The Palestinians live in congested neighborhoods, and what precious land they still possess is chiseled away by the Jewish settlers who live in these beautiful homes. The old city is frequented by the rabbis and the Jews. Okay. So anyway, we're coming to an end of Damascus. There's some problem here. So they are protected by the Jewish soldiers who are present in every corner of the old city. The atrocities of the Jewish people continues against the Muslims and Palestinians, and the cries reach the skies, but the wind blows away the world. Thank you. Sorry for all the technical lapses here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salahuddin. I think it was a fascinating, as expected, a fascinating history. And I think as much as the pictures, the scholarly work that you did was clearly evident here. We have a little bit of a problem, and that problem is that the organizers tell me we have no time left. So I'm not sure as to whether we could go on to the discussion of what the present plight of the Palestinians is, or indeed to allow for questions on the presentation that you have seen. I will try and talk to the organizers again and find out whether there is any time at all, or if there is if there isn't another presentation, then perhaps is there another thing going on here? That's why I'm sorry, but it seems as though they don't have any time.
I'm sorry about all this.
Do you have those 5 minutes? All right. First things first, before we do anything about the framework, first things first, he is going to be, Dr. Salahuddin is going to be at Liberty Bookstore and will be prepared to sign books, I assume, later today. So, Dr. Salahuddin ended his presentation with the fact that cities, areas that had been under Muslim rule, occupied by Muslims for centuries, are now under Israeli rule, having been lost in a 6-day war. There has been talk since 1967 of the fact that this occupation is illegal, this occupation is not recognized, and yet all we see is that there is the encroachment, there is a daily statement that settlements will not be permitted, are not legal, should not be done, and yet they continue. What we see today is perhaps a last-ditch effort on the part of Secretary John Kerry to try and put together a framework, not the negotiations themselves, but a framework for negotiations, the ultimate purpose of which would be to return in some measure to the 1967 borders and have a swap of land, some land that has been occupied by the settlers being allowed to remain in Israel, and in exchange, Israel surrendering land in other areas. The Palestinians have made many sacrifices in this regard. President Abbas has talked about the fact that personally he would not want to return. This is one of the issues, the right of return, that those who were in areas that became Israel in 1948, those Palestinians should be allowed to return to their homes. And he indicated that personally he was prepared to give up this right. Obviously, there was outrage in Palestine, but it was an indication of how much Palestine was prepared to change its stance in order to win a lasting and a durable peace. There has been talk of the fact that President Abbas has said that Israelis insist on maintaining a permanent military presence in order to ensure their security. He has offered to accept NATO troops, troops from Western countries, which he says are clearly allied to Israel, and therefore Israel should be happy with the security they will provide. And yet, with all this, today, perhaps there is no American who is as roundly condemned and criticized in Israel as is John Kerry. So I think the prospects of something moving to a reasonable solution are bleak. It is compounded by the fact that President Obama has a very polarized nation, not necessarily on this issue, but on other issues, and those other issues will, of course, the political impact is felt on everything that President Obama tries to do. Today, one can hope, but when one hopes, one realizes the hope is only 10% worthy of realization. Unlikely, perhaps not in, if people say not in our lifetime, I hope it is my lifetime they're talking about, because that has got a very limited space ahead of it. But one can only hope, because there have been years and years. Pakistan had played a very, very strong role earlier. The Palestine cause was Pakistan's cause, and I think Pakistan provided much support, not merely in terms of what it did itself, but what it did by way of advice to our Palestinian brothers and to others who were fighting the war against the colonial powers in Islamic lands. But now, unfortunately, I don't think that we have the same role to play. And perhaps that is a good thing. Perhaps now it is for the Palestinians and the Israelis to work this out with the rest of the Muslim world promising to endorse what the Palestinians are prepared to accept. I think all this notwithstanding, the movement is not in favor of the Palestinians. The Muslim world is divided. Syria is being torn apart. Egypt is with its internal problems in a situation where, if we are being honest, we will concede that not only in 1967, but even more so in 1967, Israel is the dominant and unquestionably dominant power of the Middle East, able virtually to dictate what it wishes. The only reason that there is hope, and the only reason I think that we were faced with the problem of terrorism and extremism, its origins lie in this particular conflict. But what I think may continue to happen, and perhaps will not bring an end to this particular menace that we are faced with, but that is the issue that perhaps will continue to press the Western world to seek a solution that is halfway acceptable. And it will be halfway acceptable, because certainly there is very little chance of the lands that were Arab all being returned to Arab sovereignty. But it's a sad note on which to end what has been a lovely presentation, but unfortunately that is the truth of the situation as we see it now. Thank you all very much for being here. I'm sorry that there was no chance for questions, but hopefully after Dr. Salahuddin finds another opportunity, you will have more time to question him on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much.